and from the professions, graduates from today's graduation ceremony that we just concluded in the Great Hall, our current students, and I'm very happy to say there's at least one busload of about-to-be students here today who have come in thanks to their art teacher having told them about the lecture, and we're delighted you're with us also. It is my honor to welcome you to the Wilkinson Lecture for 2000. I'm Professor Gary Moore, Dean of the Faculty of Architecture here at Sydney University. It's a great pleasure to welcome so many of you to the university for this very special occasion. The faculty has as its core missions teaching the next generation of professionals and scholars who will improve the quality of our environment and the quality of life within it. We also have as core missions contributing to cutting-edge research, scholarship, and creative work on the built environment, together with engagement with the professions and service to the professions and the larger community. One important part of the series is named in honor of Professor Leslie Wilkinson, Foundation Professor of Architecture in Australasia. Professor Wilkinson was appointed and served from August of 1918, when architecture was still a part of the Faculty of Science, until 1947. In 1920, the then School of Architecture was given faculty status, and Professor Wilkinson became our first dean, a position he held concurrently with the position of chair until 1947. As well as being a great professor and a great dean, he served as university architect starting in 1919 and was responsible for much of the face of the main sandstone campus, including the School of Physics, the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, which is now the Edward Ford Building, the completion of the north and west sides of the Maid Quadrangle, including the Western Tower, the east wing of the School of Botany, part of the Anderson Stewart Faculty of Medicine building, the Vice Chancellor's Quadrangle, and various gateways to and lodges on the campus. He also prepared the first master plan for the university campus, which, though officially superseded, is still influential in thinking about buildings and the public realm. The idea for the Wilkinson Lecture series arose, or so I thought, colleagues in the faculty about a year ago. With their help, we drew up a list of names from various parts of the world to address, or maybe know the rest, planning, inviting the speaker, organizing of March. I received a very kind email letter from Michael Neustein. I hope you're in the audience tonight, Michael. An alumnus, BArch 1971. Mr. Neustein wrote, "I would like to accept your invitation to hear Harry Seidler deliver the Wilkinson Lecture. However," he continued, "I must point out that this is not the inaugural Wilkinson Lecture, as this was delivered by Gough Whitlam in 1968 or 1969 at the behest of the Sydney University Architecture Society of the time. The lecture was organized by the late Michael Dickinson, a graduate of either 1969 or 1970. Whitlam's lecture was a preliminary exposition of his ideas for Australia's cities and their suburbs. These ideas were crucial," Mr. Neustein concluded, "to his election in 1972. Yes, Michael, you are absolutely correct. I immediately called my predecessor of two ago, and my colleague and friend, Professor Peter Johnson, who, by the way, sends his apologies, is in New Zealand at a Commonwealth Association of Architects meeting. Professor Johnson confirmed that SUAS, in conjunction with the faculty, organized the lecture that was given in the Great Hall and was introduced by the then Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Bruce Williams. The Wilkinson Lecture was actually given in July of 1969 and was indeed E.G. Whitlam's first major talk on urban affairs. Thanks to our wonderful librarians in the Dennis Winston Architecture Library, we have since found the typescript of the lecture, published by the Sydney University Architecture Society, An Urban Nation, first annual Leslie Wilkinson Lecture. The preface, unsigned unfortunately, credits Mr. Michael Dickinson for the foresight for calling such a desirable communication from the man who would soon become Prime Minister, and who had such a positive impact ultimately on our urban environment. Well, there wasn't, until today, a second Wilkinson Lecture, but I can assure you I have every intention of continuing this as an annual event. We're privileged to have as the second Wilkinson Lecture a person who has had also a profound impact on the quality of architecture and urban life in Australia. I believe it is fair to say that today's Wilkinson Lecture has done more than any other single person to elevate architecture in Australia, and he was the first to give it truly international profile. It is an honor to have him continue the tradition of Wilkinson and Whitlam and relaunch the Wilkinson Lecture series. But let me not say any more. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Mr. James Gross to formally introduce our speaker today. James Gross, as many of you know, is himself a very fine architect, an alumnus of our faculty, having graduated Bachelor of Architecture in 1985. He is now a senior designer with Bly Voller Neild here in Sydney, with offices across Australia. Rather than reciting a litany of accomplishments and credits to his name, which I could do, I will only say that our speaker today, our main speaker of today, has said of our introducer, and I quote from a conversation, "Ah, yes, James. He is a very good architect. He will go a long way." For those of you who know our main speaker, this is very warm praise indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the Wilkinson Lecturer for 2000, Mr. James Gross.
Well, there have been plenty of words written over 50 years of Harry's practice life about him and his architecture, so I thought that I'd make a few remarks about what it was like to have been a student of Harry's. Actually, I first spoke to Harry back in 1981. He probably won't remember this. I was living in Brisbane and working as the graphic designer for the revamped RAIA journal Architecture Australia. After many years of the publication resembling really a badly designed building products magazine, Harry deemed that it had raised itself to an acceptable level of design for his buildings to be published in it. There were many telephone conversations about how I was to take great care of the very valuable Max Dupain photographs and where this plan should go and drawing and so on. You might say he was somewhat over-involved from a graphic designer's point of view, but of course his reputation had preceded him, so I was prepared. Anyway, the issue came out and Harry subsequently called me on the phone, and in typical Harry fashion, and I apologise at this point of having to do this accent, but telling stories about Harry requires you to use an accent. And he said, "Mr. Gross, you've done a very handsome job with the design." And then he said, "There's just one thing. The front cover photograph, you got it back to front." We're not all perfect. Well, I survived that indignity, and a year or two later, having decided to finish my architecture degree at the University of Sydney, I found myself in his design studio for my final year. And the procedure was that Mr. Seidler would sit at the table and each student would present to him their work from their previous student years. Now, this is in 1984, remember, and we were all fairly adroit at the yellow trace and coloured pencil technique in the mode of Mr. Michael Graves. In the days, as Harry would say, of the vile and poisonous disease of postmodernism. So it was my turn, and Harry sat, and naturally we all stood. And I gently unrolled my yellow trace. It's very delicate, and we're all very proud of it. Crushes very easily. And I laid it out for Harry to see, and he looked up at me, and I can still see that expression, that over-the-glasses look. I'm quite tall, he was sitting down. And he said, "Mr. Gross, we know you're a good graphic designer, but this," he said, "this is shit." Such was my introduction to Harry Seidler, teacher. But fast forward to the end of the studio, and Harry said I could come over to his place on Saturday afternoon and he would help me take pictures of my models. And to this day, whenever I take pictures of models, which I still do, I use these techniques. Anyway, we spent some time taking the pictures and so on, and then he said, "Hey, you want to come up and see my darkroom?" And we scrambled up the hill to underneath where the garage is to the darkroom, and he spent about an hour or so showing me the equipment and photographs he'd taken and so on. Then on Monday morning I arrived at university at 9 o'clock. It was hand-in day, of course, and waiting for me was an envelope full of 10 by 8 black and white prints that Harry had obviously worked on during Sunday, got to the office early on Monday morning and couriered them over so I could have them at 9 o'clock. And so it was that Harry exposed to me his passion, his dedication, his generosity, his absolute commitment to architecture. And these things have remained with me to this day. Harry, as a teacher, of course, talked about postmodern nonsense, decried the mediocrity of bureaucrats and the lack of vision of the architectural profession. Nothing changes. But importantly, what I learnt from him was a means of thinking about architecture, a way of making buildings that relies on a fundamental understanding of tectonics, a word he would not use, I'm sure, but tectonics nevertheless. That is, the poetry of construction and the poetry of assembly. It was Harry who taught me that the fundamental act of architecture lies in the synthesis of plan, section and structure. Simple concepts, you might say, but obfuscated beyond belief by the rash of stylists, postmodernists, rationalists, Dadaists, futurists and so on of the mid-80s. So I thought it was appropriate to dig out my copy of Towards a New Architecture, the seminal text by Le Corbusier published in 1927, to remind us of one of those fundamental tenets that underpins Harry Seidler's work. And it goes on, "The plan is the generator. Without a plan, you have lack of order and willfulness. The plan holds in itself the essence of sensation. Modern life demands and is waiting for a new kind of plan, both for the house and for the city." As a student, to see the house that Harry built for his family at Kalara was for me a pivotal moment. Standing on the lawn, looking at a perfectly resolved architectural composition, rooted in plan and in section and in structure, transformed into plastic sculptural form, the perfect abstraction of the sandstone outcrops and the stringy eucalypt forest surrounding it. And this is no temporal, stylish imagery. This house was built in 1967 and is the embodiment, again to quote our good friend Corb, when I find it, that architecture is the masterly, correct and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. It is indeed my pleasure to invite Adjunct Professor Dr. Harry Seidler to present the second inaugural Wilkinson address. Thank you.
Thank you, James. It's marvelous to be reminded of one's youth. It's pretty close to the mark, I guess, what he remembers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to first of all do is go back in history of 50 years, and it's with great pleasure that I've always remembered Professor Wilkinson. I came here in 1948, apparently just a year after he had retired from Sydney University as its professor, head of the school. He was a tall, very impressive man with a white pointed beard, and I had seen his buildings here on the campus, which had been mentioned by Dean Moore. And one must say, although of course stylistically not my cup of tea, but they were workmanlike and competent, tough-looking buildings. And as I came to meet him later on, he said, well, this is the country that should have a Mediterranean kind of architecture. And what's more, he espoused his notion about the way people should build townhouses, city houses, he called it, instead of this spread of endless suburbia. He said they've got to make up their mind. Do they want to live in a city or live in suburbia? It's the most apt and appropriate comment to make even to this day. Anyway, our occasional friendship, and of course he was many years older than I, he said after I'd built this first house, he said, look, I'd really like to come and see this house. So I made arrangements for him to come and visit. And for a man who had absolutely no connection with contemporary architecture at the time, he was just full of amazement at what met the eye. And I recall particularly, and I think that's particularly apt, he said, you know, our architecture doesn't have the kind of reflections that one sees. You know, this is a new element in architecture that was totally new to him, to see big glass walls. Not only do you, in that case, see the reflection of nature, but on re-entrant corners, you see the one side extending visually through the sort of transparency that is created. So he was full of enthusiasm at the time about reflectivity of the modern architecture. So I think it is marvelous to have had, and I knew architects who had been his students over the years, again, another generation to me, but to have had a head of a school that was hands-on involved in building, and as you know, he built a great deal in Sydney, and houses that are still highly regarded, and they've lasted well. Now, I'd like to start off by reiterating some of my early years before I came to Australia, which was 1948. It's been said, you know, I was born in Europe but ended up in North America. And aside from studying at, again, now Dean's alma mater, University of Manitoba, I made a beeline as soon as this was possible to study at Harvard under Gropius. The world had heard that Gropius was now the head of the school at Harvard, and people who lived at that time, especially after the traumatic years of the Second World War, were just straining at the leash to build, to see an emergence of the kind of architecture we'd only seen in books like those of Corbusier, who had built in the 1920s. And to have the opportunity to study with him was something quite privileged, really, for me to encounter. So in 1945, I entered that institution, and what we knew about the background of this great teacher, and he was a remarkable pedagogue in the way he presented and stimulated students, generating a real amazing enthusiasm amongst them, was the fact that this man had built. He had built things that were simply not to be seen in North America, and at that stage there was simply no present day, as it were, buildings in either New York or Boston or anywhere else in the United States, other than a few examples of maybe Frank Lloyd Wright's houses, of course, that are the very essence of American architecture at that time. But what we knew about was the school, the Bauhaus, which he had founded in 1919 in Germany, and which over the years, and certainly even then, was the object of much derision. People said, oh, what a terrible thing was being taught there. Of course, the Nazis had closed it in 1933, and its teachers went all over the world. One even came to Australia and was totally unrecognized, Hirschfeld Mack, who taught at Geelong Grammar School. So the Bauhaus was considered anathema to what is good in architecture, but to us students, this was a very important background for the man that confronted us. And on the right here, you see a group of us surrounded, as was quite common, with Gropius sitting in the middle. And whenever he gave criticism to a student, everybody else gathered around to hear the argument and the, what he said and found about it. And he was quite, vicious in his criticisms. As he said later on, it's very good if I made students unhappy, because there's no use patting them on the back. They should keep on searching and not feel complacent about it. The only thing that we found tangibly again of Gropius, and this is just a fragment of his own house, which he built in 1937, and it's one of the few of a group of houses around the Boston area that showed us an uncompromising piece of architecture. And what is so characteristic of it is, of course, it's crystallic, clear, and machine-made looking, elegant, minimal detailing, but there's this transparency. Wherever you look, there's sculptural projections and a transparency going through. And this is, as I will show later on, a characteristic thing that was at that time, and still is to some extent, characteristic of in the world of art and painting. The main arguments that ensued in these criticisms were about aesthetics. Why is this better than that? And who says that, where's the essence of where we should start? We discount the tradition in architecture, the stylism, and everybody accused him, of course, of starting an international style. That's not so. The basis of it is to study how our eyes respond predictably to visual stimuli. And that really is what prompted me to search this out at his recommendation to study at Black Mountain College, which is a very progressive institution in the United States, North Carolina, headed by Joseph Albers, an ex-teacher at the Bauhaus, who left Germany immediately the Bauhaus was closed. He was an amazing teacher because he made students experiment and think through objects in that he made you design or investigate and explore three-dimensionality. And if I could just say something about the course, it was one in visual fundamentals. And I like the quote from something he had written later on. He said, when the discrepancy between physical fact and psychological effect is at a maximum, there lies the threshold of art. In other words, to do something and just have it and that's it is simply not enough. He says 1 and 1 is 3 in art, or shall be 3 in art. There's that intangible element to do just simple lines, as in his constellations, structural constellations. You can see this in many ways. He tricks the eye. Sometimes this is at the bottom. Other times that is at the top. And the two, of course, are irreconcilable. So there is not just the physical fact of the lines, but there's this psychological effect which is maximized due to the minimal effort that is exposed. Now, this has direct application to architecture, I believe, because as Gropius has said, that we must bring the obvious 3 things into unison: the use of a building, the technology that we use to bring it about, and its relationship to the arts of the time. And I'd like to quote what Gropius said during 1954, when he was here in May at the invitation of the Institute of Architects to give some very fine addresses at this university. In fact, he was a recipient of, as I have been honored today, to become an honorary doctor, given an honorary doctor's degree here. Now, he said, architecture must move on or die. Its new life must come from the tremendous changes in the social, technical, and artistic fields in recent times. Neither medievalism or colonialism can express the life of 20th century man. There is no finality in architecture, only continuous change. End of quote. Well, this had a great effect, and I relate this architectural formula, as it were, because this is not stylism. He's never talked about an international style. It's a misnomer, and that's bandied around far too much in our world, because we are talking about an architecture that's in flux, and we are intrigued, at that time at least, in Albus's world, with getting more for the physical fact that we actually perform. It has implications of economy and obviously a brilliant Gordian knot sort of solution to planning problems. So the most for the least. He painted squares. One would think not a very remarkable thing to paint colors squares. But what they do is amazing, because they do so much more than their physical fact. This tone here, although a plain color, there's no gradation in it, but it looks graded because, of course, what is adjacent to it. It looks darker here than it does here, only because what's relates to it. So this is the more that we get for a minimal effort. After studies at those two institutions and being confronted with two of the Bauhaus teachers, I went to work for Breuer in New York, and I did a lot of his drawings. This is a drawing of mine, which is in one of his books, but it's difficult to see. It's a timber house. That's his own timber house. And one of the things he was obsessed with is to extract the absolute most out of a system of minimal effort and material. These are timber walls, and you would think they'll barely stand up in themselves. He insisted on making them act like enormous cantilevers. This construction here with plywood and with diagonal boarding in it was assembled so that a house could actually support hanging elements. You know, there's no steel or anything. It's purely that one material. The minimal thing doing an incredibly maximum thing. And with this went explorations of spatial feelings, which are, of course, a very integral part of that era and still alive today. The elements that define the space that the eye wanders in between. This is just a ground floor plan of part of a building that we were working on at the time. Now, the fourth person who I was very fortunate to work with on the way to Australia, that is, in 1948, is Niemeyer. This, of course, wasn't built then. It was very recently built. And the reason why I show it, and this, of course, is Niemeyer here in 1948, and that's me as a young man. Niemeyer was known, and Gropius commented on him being the Paradiesvogel, you know, the bird of paradise, this extraordinary outpouring of exuberant forms, but they are harnessed within intensely logical and minimal patterns of organization. This building he built just in recent years, just finished last year. It's a museum that stands on it's like a mushroom hanging in midair. an amazing construction. And what, sorry. The form of this building even recalls, that line recalls the famous Sugarloaf Mountain in the distance. This is in Rio Harbor, along the Rio Harbor. The amazing thing, and one thing that gives me hope in this world, is this man, Niemeyer, today is 92 years old, and he just built that. At my age, that certainly gives you hope. Now, in the year 1948, I came to Sydney to visit my parents and to build them a house. I had no real intention of staying here at the time. And these are images I took in that year. Sydney had two aspects to it. A sea of suburban brick and tile roofs, but I was immediately attracted, as Gropius was later on also, at the quite superb terrace houses. The only regret one may have, and this shows you how long ago it is, because they're in perfect condition still. And nowadays, of course, people ruin them, and nothing is being done about that, in spite of all the so-called concern about our heritage. Paddington, I think, should be a district that should be insisted on being put back to the way it was on day one. But of course we have Greenway, who built some superb architecture, and all this, the reason why I'm so attracted to it is that it is really English Georgian architecture of the time, the mid-19th century, early 19th century, but translated into a climate that isn't 50 degrees from the equator, but 30, 40 degrees from the equator. And that was very intelligent transformation. People felt intuitively the climate and the obvious response to it to provide shade, and that I wish we still had as much common sense as people did when they came and built here in the early days of its settlement. But what really finally made me absolutely delighted with, oh, what am I doing here? Is the location I was fortunate to find right on Sydney Harbour, living in a basement of a building that I proceeded to remodel in 1948. And I lived there and worked there. And it was just next to this reserve. And that's the view one got. No houses on the other side, hardly any. And magnificent environment, which it still is. In spite of what man is doing to it, it is something that I've never stopped loving, as is so easy to do. And this is the first house I built. The reason why I was brought here to build a house for my parents. The early houses were obviously very much related and derivative of the kind of architecture that I saw Gropius and Breuer build in the United States. They were lightweight buildings. That was exacerbated by the fact that there was little alternative to it, other than digging the actual sandstone out of the garage here and building stones with it, because you couldn't get any building material. So it had to be timber. That was about all that was available. But years thereafter, I came to appreciate that lightweight materials, or even some steel that one could get, is not the real answer to our climatic and other conditions. We just don't have the time nor the ability to maintain such buildings. They are essentially thermally unstable. So I preferred, and years later I certainly looked to building tough and thermally more stable structures. But this is now 1950, fairly early on, and that was, although my parents' house was in the so-called outside the brick area. You know, you don't worry about houses that are in the bush. But when it comes to a brick area, that's when you have to behave yourself. And that's where the action of our system of local government got into the act, and they have all, ever since then that I've been here and before, full aesthetic control over what is to be built. And here's just one of those things that immediately brought me into conflict with local authority. One always wins these things in the long term, but the arguments are really quite obscene and culturally unsupportable. I cannot understand how our society can keep on giving aesthetic jurisdiction to however well-meaning the layman in charge may be. But we'll talk about that still. But this is one of the earliest confrontations, which was quite a bitter one. Why I show this picture is that the relationship between art and architecture that Gropius and people at the Bauhaus always confirmed, that the vision of a time, the tendency to do things in a particular way is synonymous in all the arts. You don't build heavy architecture and have transparent paintings happening at the same time. So this is Moholy Nagy, who of course is well known enough, rendering these geometric forms in a way that makes them look as though you could look through them. And also the minimal amount of, there are only two elements, there's the diagonal, the rhomboid sort of shapes that interact, and the circle. But and this I saw as a coincidence also evident in these early houses. But in about 1967, we built this house, and there's many in between, of course. This house, as was mentioned by James, was built then, and it certainly is one of these, as architecture should be, tough, virtually everlasting. It just doesn't decay. I'd like to quote John Ruskin, who I'm sure you'll know, and he said, "When we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for the present delight, nor for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for." That's a tall order to meet. We're in this day and age where everything is sort of throwaway society, but I still think that in man's background, what we admire is the magnificence of buildings that have been superbly put together many, many years ago. So in the 1960s, I should show this again, Theo van Doesburg, the spatial exploration of in between these planes, hovering planes that seem to suspend in space horizontally and vertically, have some relationship to the tendency of creating space which is made possible by the technological means at our disposal. So these parallels, I think, are of importance as they emerge even in a different form, as we will see later on. In the 60s, I befriended a man, also an immigrant, Dick Dasseldorp, a very tough businessman, developer, engineer from Holland, who had come to do certain work in the Snowy Mountains, which wasn't very successful. But he saw the uniqueness of this country just at its threshold of mushrooming and development. And he managed, unbelievably, to assemble 30 different properties in the middle of Sydney. This is Pitt Street here, and I think that's Hunter Street. Today, all of these, of course, would be declared national monuments, every one of these buildings. But he managed to get them pulled down and build one tower. And at first, at first, of course, again, it was refused, you know, you can't. It was a little higher than it ended up, but still there was antagonism against the very idea. But when it finally did get built, it was about the only tall building standing on the landscape. There's the AMP building standing there, the first one. Some building near Circular Quay, the Opera House. In this picture, that would be the mid-1960s or late 60s, about 66. It was the only really tall building. And what I did there is really work on two lines. The method of attack was to find a man to give advice of how really to build a fireproof concrete building of that height. And I recommended I should consult with Nervi, which I did, and Dusseldorp not only sent me around the world to go and pick a sculptor, which you saw in the picture before, ended up with the Calder outside Australia Square, but Nervi I visited in 1963, and he had built just recently then the Olympic buildings for the 1960 Rome Olympics. And he used the most ingenious methods, not only structurally but constructionally. He was a builder as well as an innovative engineer. I spent some 3 weeks there, and I really learned about how to put not only design structurally the building, but to express the structure, the bones of the building, such that it forms an integral part of the means. Here's the building built without any scaffolding, just precast elements on the outside, and this is hallmark, of course, of Nervi's, the ferrocement pans that produced these interlocking ribs when filled with concrete on the top. I might say that the time I spent with Nervi in Rome was one that gave me the opportunity to really look and study in depth the architecture of the Baroque, particularly Borromini, who was an ingenious man in terms of also the kind of way in which he exploited structural possibilities of vaulting and arching in quite a new way for its time. So Nervi stood for the fusion of structure and construction simultaneously. The other thing that I learned or saw so much of in Europe are these delightful squares in the congested medieval cities of the hearts of most European towns. And I felt that, all right, you build a tall building rather than a 12-story building covering the whole site. You build one 50 stories, but it only covers a small amount of the site given the same area. And you leave the rest open and give it to the public, such as they have enjoyed for time immemorial. And it had a very modest beginning. This is a picture taken in 1967 when the project was finished. There's a fountain and the beginning of a tree, and people used to have a sort of nervously sat there. It's unusual to have this open space suddenly come to life in the city. But there's a picture taken maybe a year or two ago in the same space. And it's unbelievable how people respond and love this getting together outdoors. Our climate gives us the facility to do that, and other people are envious of this. But the tragedy is, of course, that today our city fathers and all the town planners and their notions, this is disallowed in Sydney. You are not allowed to build open private space given over to the public. It is incomprehensible to me why this is so. Given the evidence that people obviously like this kind of thing, in Sydney you have to build every building solidly onto the footpath with a podium so-called, and if you want a tower, well then hide it coming out of the middle of it. No open space. And the result of the congestion and the constriction of it all is everybody is aware of that. Nervi taught us how to build structures that span long distances with a minimal of means, minimal of material. This is a structure of our own office where we made precast elements, and Nervi helped us produce the shape. And structurally, this is totally reflective of what happens in the middle of a beam and what happens at the end of a beam, where shear takes over from bending in the middle. And that is the truth of nature. That's what it wants to be. And the concrete's only 3 inches thick, or something like 70, 80 millimeters. So you do the maximum for a minimum of effort. Again, it's the same message. And spatially, what in years later we are able to do with pre-stressing of slabs is just incredible. We couldn't have dreamt of such a thing in years in the past. Large projects exploiting the same technique, long span beams, in this case 25 meters long, and cross beams were built by means of very elaborate gantries. This is 1974. That's the only way we had of lifting these 80-ton beams. Maybe I can get this sharper. No. It's about 16 meters across, 25 meters long element here. But the interesting thing is, of course, that is a very outdated routine, because in those days we didn't have mobile cranes that can pick up 200 tons like a feather. And today you get on the phone and get a crane to pick this thing up, and you don't need all this moving gantry, which is enormously complicated. So it just shows that life goes on. It's constantly improving itself. Here is a response to a site in Paris where we were told from a planning point of view to respect these two axes, and that was our response to the embassy, which is an office building, marvelous view that way. All the offices look that way, and all the living rooms of an apartment building adjacent look the same way. Nervi helped us with that too, but the interesting thing is that to stretch out and make use of a panoramic outlook is, of course, a simple logical response, and that it results in this kind of geometry of wanting the panorama on the other side of this building. This is the non-view side, as it were. But again, the parallel between what was happening at the time by some painters, there were several, but this is Stella, is a well-known painter. The quadrant, of course, relates to the square, and it has a similar tendency of opposition, which is characteristic both in architecture and in painting at the time. And here's Nervi's beams, as I described before, where they change from a T in the middle to a rectangle at the end. And there's nothing more you need to do to it. You just paint it white on the underside, and that's the structure and its finish. And so it went on. Nervi told us, when you want to build a really tall building in concrete, you should make the columns twist. Is it possible to get this sharper? I can't do it here. Seems a bit fuzzy. Anyway, he said, assemble the load in as few columns as you can, heavily loaded columns. That gives greater stability and express the fact that this building is tall, and the columns change in cross-section. Here they are at the bottom, and at the top they're flush with the top of the building. And this building also was built in a minimum of time for its yeah, you can see these changing columns here. It casts a shadow there, and it twists and becomes all precast with exposed white quartz on the outside. Now, you win some and lose some. There's an invited competition for a big bank in Hong Kong this was our response, utilizing this sort of technology of just to leave an open banking hall at the base of this huge building. The bank's director, who had visited all the 7 architects from around the world who were invited to compete, he said, of course, Foster in London won the competition. He rang up and he said, sorry you didn't get that. I'm the president of the Hong Kong club. How would you like to do that instead? So I got a consolation prize. Which is that. And again, what this makes possible, this sort of stretching and tensioning the structure and tying it together vertically and horizontally, is the magnificent openness that is possible. The club with offices on top, they didn't want to know that there's something else going on. They were used to having their own entrance here, and the governor's balcony had to be reproduced in the days when Hong Kong was a colony. They wanted this freedom and openness without having posts in the middle of the building. And this technology made that possible. And we extended this technique of responding to, in a shape, what the building is for, which is to let officers, ideally looking at water up and down the Brisbane River. There's the river. So the shape of the building actually comes about, so 2/3 of the people see the water, which would not be so easily possible any other way. Here's the structure that results from that. Evenly spaced columns, all straight elements, nothing's curved. It only takes on the look of a curved building. But then to make the entrance at this facade here more imposing, rather than taking every one of these posts down, we collected them into this hyperboloid shape, which again, Nervi recommended as being responsive to the loads that are upon it. And of course the canopy, which is appropriate to the climate of Brisbane, we create enormous downpours. The fact that these 2 huge columns need to be stabilized back against the core of the building, this kind of ribbing came into existence, which, although responding to structural loads, it's also attractive to look at. This is a picture of Grosvenor Place in its day, and you can see how the cities, it was still quite open when it was built in about 1982. And now this is all chock-a-block full of buildings, and we will get to talk about the town planning problems and responses to that. There are some people who like to look out from offices. They complain about they being shut up inside, air-conditioned cocoon, as it were. And we responded to that by providing some people with deep recessed balconies. And I think that takes away from the monotony that inevitably results, and also the other thing that this building does, as the previous one, is that it's full glass walls. But I think what makes such buildings far more appropriate to our climate is the fact that we shade them. Provide external shades. Some Venetian blinds don't do the job. They just simply stop the light, but not the heat, and they certainly also stop the outlook. People want to see the view, and these sunshades, which are all at different angles, depending on where the sun is, horizontal where it's on the north, and vertical where it's east or west. And only one kind of beam, mass-produced beam, all the same. We saw the structural plan there before. And that again is not only visual, but tangible economics. It's simply cheaper to mass-produce elements and make them all the same, rather than make everything different, which is so commonly done nowadays. And we invited Stella to bring his work into this lobby or public area of the building. And here, really for the first time, quite extraordinary things seem to be happening in the painter's world, and that they've come away from the minimalist forms that are so applicable and interesting to architects. There's a greater richness suddenly emerging. And this then finally had also an interest in our shape making. Here again is one of these tall buildings in Perth with a public plaza, in this case wind sheltered because it's a windy place. But again, a very, very popular open space that isn't normally done, and as I say in Sydney, actually forbidden. Same formula, depending on the sun orientation, there's even a need to shade from oblique sun, where the building goes around another configuration. You can see the horizontal shades vertically and vertical shades casting shadow horizontally. It's not always that one can get a freestanding site where a logical structure and form of a building can be developed. Here's one that is squeezed in between other buildings, and we divided that into 4 fields and left 2 open, but not above each other, but changing from vertical to horizontal to the other side vertical. And that produced this sort of stepped section of the building. And we planted trees on these shelves so that with an attractive outlook onto trees, because there's simply no opportunity to have windows on the sides of such a terrible piece of real estate. That again comes into being because of the lack of foresight planning. We still have the boundaries of the 19th century to live with, and they produce very often senseless sort of buildings. So the transparency and the configuration of that is something that again gives an opportunity, if one exploits that, of quite a different atmosphere than a freestanding building that you enter from into the center. This is the glassy lobby, but the rest of it is turned into a kind of forest under the building itself. I mentioned the emerging flamboyance in a lot of painters' work, and this now goes to the early 80s. And that, I think, has its response in a lot of the forms that emerged. And why are they shaped like that? Unless they had some good reason, I think one wouldn't do that. But the need was to be able to put furniture, in this case big deck chairs, in some part of it. There's no need to make it everywhere, but the form emerged that way. We've used that kind of form, which makes a lot of sense for a balcony in other spaces. And because there's a lot of more glass here, it's higher glass, so the projection of the roof is cut further to shade it. So it's the two things should match together. The need, the structure, and this of course is pre-stressed concrete, and the aesthetic orientation. Houses, wherever we find like this sort of thing, again, the steel industry can now take a steel beam and twist it around like spaghetti, any shape you like. And that's not really a difficult thing to do with the kind of mechanisms that today exist. And what it yields both externally and internally is this greater richness, away from the, as people have always said, the old shoebox architecture, you know, on its end, and the greater richness of form, which some people have even labeled its Baroque influence. It may be so, but it's a bit of a far-fetched comparison. Now this shows that the early confrontations that I had with local councils really persists, and in fact has now become far worse than it ever was, because a new element's been added to this edict that the local council determines whether something's aesthetically acceptable or not. And in this case it was a bitter fight, and the characteristic of those fights are that councils take you on, you spend your money into this quasi-court that exists, which is really, I think, an outrageous institution, because in any normal court of law, you fight a case, and if you win, the other side has to pay your costs. Not so here. You pay your own costs. So architects are confronted with having this so-called court presided over not by legal people, but by, I don't know, retired bureaucrats mostly. There are lawyers, there are judges there, but they deal with matters of big money usually, not aesthetic matters. So here they thought the house was too small. We're not allowed to build. We don't like the shape of that roof. To put a pitched roof on it, that'll be all right. It's a very large house, huge open space. Can't we do something about the focusing of this? I can't do it from here. It's a pity. Seems to be getting worse. Nobody can help us with that? Yeah. Never mind. Now let me switch tack aside from this unpleasantness of local government. I'll still have something to say about that. But I want to just revert back to 1957, when a group of us, with the realization that the local council has decided in McMahon's Point to zone it for waterfront industry. They were going to put cement works around the waterfront. The people who wanted this, of course, had a lot of power behind them, the industries, and that was about to be zoned industry. And so we, young architects at the time, a group of us got together and did this hypothetical notion about how this whole peninsula could be turned into a high-density residential area. Instead of 12 people per acre out in the outskirts of the city, you could house 300 people per acre. And yet arrange buildings in such a way that they don't block each other's view. They step down toward the water. And there was one tall building on the peninsula which doesn't take anyone's view away, as long as all the others are low here and medium on the slopes, and the tall towers go up to the ridge of the peninsula. This is purely hypothetical, but still, in this day and age, one would think it would make a lot of sense. And of course, the one building was much maligned in the press. The only one built was the one on the peninsula. The end result is this: the absolute antithesis. They built tall buildings right on the waterfront, blocking everybody behind, and this is a garage, multi-story garage, enjoying the greatest view of the Opera House and the harbour. So much for local government planning. Again, many attempts, this goes back to 1969 on the left, attempt to urge those who make new suburbs, which is still underway, people subdivide potato fields into crisscross streets, to encourage traffic to be taken around areas with dead-end streets leading to houses, and then a focal point, the shopping, the primary school, and medium-density housing of this kind to be at the core, and the core to represent some element of a focus for this these units of the community. But none of this has really happened to any extent in this country. But there's the great push back in from the suburb now because the just total inadequacy and hopelessness of communication with a city that now stretches beyond 60 kilometers from one side to the other. And the traffic is just horrendous. You can't get from here to there. Public transport is inadequate and can't ever cope with such a spread out conurbation. So the great fashion at the moment, I don't know how long it'll last, is of course for people to come back to the city and try and live closer to the city. And here, a unique piece of land which allowed nowhere else to build so high in the suburbs. It was a piece of federal government property that had no height limit on it. So this building came into existence, and it does, of course, do an incredible thing. People have never seen Sydney Harbour or lived with Sydney Harbour in such a magnificent combination with seeing the skyline of the city, seeing the water, and wrapping the apartments around so as to partake of this panorama virtually all the way around. You can see out this way, that way, and there. But this is virtually disallowed in almost all the municipalities around the harbour. They want to keep the status quo. And another thing we did, and this harks back to the space making and the scintillation and opposition that I think is so much an integral part of the painter's world, is to switch living rooms into bedrooms on consecutive floors. Just exchange them, giving people the choice. You can look more at the city or more of the water, and the reverse on subsequent floors. You could further more that way and further that way. And that gives this sort of staggering new scintillation to the facade, which seems to have struck a note in people quite liking this. And the balconies, as I mentioned before, they have a wide part for furniture. You can really go and have a luncheon party on the terrace, which is not usually possible on normal sort of square gangplank-like terraces. We enticed Sol DeWitt, the New York painter, to give us an artwork for the lobby. And I think that, again, is something that reflects the entrance pier of the building and an amazing color world they produced in between. Let me just show a house that I think is just about the ultimate of what one can do in a house that is truly in the middle of magnificent nature. It's in the Southern Highlands, on top of a cliff, hundreds of hectares around it with no other man-made thing to be seen, a river down the bottom, and a great cliff, and there's the house sitting up on that cliff. I think it's a rare opportunity to build such a thing, which is really the almost ultimate thing one can do. But believe it or not, that house was forbidden, disallowed by the council. Why? It doesn't fit in. I don't know what with, but it doesn't fit in, and they didn't like it. And so you fork out thousands of dollars and you take them to court, and as usual, on the threshold of the court, the day before the hearing, they say, okay, we'll stamp your plans, as long as you pay your own costs. Well, that time I'd had enough. 50 years of it is quite enough, and guided and helped by my lawyer daughter, Polly, I was told that, well, under certain special circumstances, you can get your costs. And she says, don't go to a lawyer, you argue the case. And this actually did take place before a judge. And although that jurisdiction doesn't allow costs, I got full. And I think that should be a pattern to young architects who come to me and say, you know, what's the use of trying to build a modern house? They won't let you do it. It doesn't fit in. And I would encourage them to take them on and I think they're likely to win and get their costs. But who needs all this waste of time? And it really is an anti-cultural phenomenon in our society. Now let me just finally show something that I think responds to a great problem that, the city of Vienna, because it shows one thing that is again something that's simply anathema to our authorities, and that is when you have an existing old building, its neighbor must either be kept in the way of just the front or be made to look the same as what's there. And they see that as the right way to develop a city. Nothing like that happens in this ancient capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where they have a 13th century cathedral right opposite the glassy modern building, 18th century Biedermeier, all kinds of excellent buildings all around the cathedral, each of its time. And they're stunning, absolutely stunning combination. Nothing could be worse than somebody saying, well, give me a medieval, imitation here. Now, Vienna is a city that had beautiful facades in the 19th century, classic, very elaborate architecture, but horrifically inadequate housing. There were 7 people living in apartments like that, where there's a room and the kitchen. And the kitchen has no windows. And there were 7 people living in these 2 rooms. No plumbing. There's plumbing in the corridor. Anyway, there were draconian conditions for the people before and after the First World War. So government came into being on a platform, and when the monarchy collapsed in 1918, they said, we will build housing for people. And that was the platform that they had then, and it's still their platform today. And it's, although we hear about the federal government having gone into some strange dead-end right-wing direction, the fact is that the city of Vienna is a left-wing government still, as it was then, even today. And they do have some highly intelligent planners. Am I showing that? Yeah. Anyway, this is the kind of housing. This is the most famous one, the Karl Marx Hof, built in about 1924. And they're huge numbers. The city owns 230,000 apartments, and they're rental apartments. You never own it, but you can live there for the rest of your life. If you get sick, the rent is subsidized. If you die, you can leave the apartment to your children. And just watching how people in our society are hounded by outrageously high percentage of their incomes being spent on housing that mostly is inadequate. Anyway, it is just amazing to see such a procedure persisting into this day. Now, the city, the city of Vienna invited us to attack. This is the brief, as it were. They said, along the river here, the Danube, there's an expressway, and we're going to cover this expressway, and on top of it, we're going to build housing. And they showed me a pattern. They said, this is the planners coming up with a tangible, and that's what I say, it doesn't exist here. Planners here saying, we've estimated that it should be able to support X numbers of apartments in 6-story buildings. We've done our homework to see that it's economically possible to bridge this expressway, and that would cost less than if we had to buy more than half a kilometer of waterfront land, which is now alienated and cut off from the hinterland. Everything's 6 stories high, and there's existing housing from the 50s or whenever. And they said, that's not a design, but that's the brief. That's how much we want on the site, and that's more or less the given circumstances. And it didn't take us very long to come up with an alternative to their rigid putting everything across at right angles, because then people look into each other, which is something quite horrendous, as I'll show you in a minute. We turned the angles, these blocks at an angle. And here's a tower off the expressway to put more people into the tower so as to loosen up the development here, not to make it so dense. The tower is now going up here. And I think the procedure then was this, that's what the city had proposed, to put 5 beams that carry a whole building. And next to it, the beams carry virtually nothing, only a few trees. Whereas if you turn it at an angle and you still find room in between these beams for the lift pitch, you distribute that over 19 or 18 beams. And therefore they said, oh, well, the engineer said, if you only distribute the lot, then you will give you an extra 2 floors. So you can make it 8 stories high, and therefore loosening the thing up, having more open space between the buildings in order to allow people to enjoy their environment. Here's what happened. That part of it's finished and occupied. Is every certain numbers of mix of apartments, 2 or 3 bedroom apartments, automatically results in a certain size kindergarten. Kindergarten is here. Community buildings here and there. Entertainment complex being virtually finished now at the end. Some 14 movie houses, restaurants, and everything else in there. And that's all financed by the city. I asked somebody, what do you pay down here? He had the ground floor apartments all have their own, this man in here, they have private gardens, so that's suitable for families with little children. So he's located just there. I said, what do you pay for this? He's got 3 bedrooms, a brand new apartment right on the riverfront, never be able to be built out. He pays $178 a week rent. And I think in Sydney, you probably have to pay millions to get such an apartment. And yet, very high taxation in Austria, and their GST, or Mehrwertsteuer, is 20% on everything you buy. So that's the kind of money, obviously, that pays for these for this public housing. That's the entertainment complex, and that's one of the community facilities. There are saunas and gymnasiums and all kinds of things, all part of the same thing. And there's a budget for artworks. We chose Lynn Utzon, who lived here when her father built the opera house and still likes coming back here. Lives now in Denmark mostly, and we chose her as the artist, and she did this gold and aluminium colored, silver colored metal applied sculptures to some of the buildings. Penelope and I have an apartment in this project. That's our flat there. It's because we go there and still ongoing commitments there. And this tower, which is in construction, also contains about 300 apartments and some offices, places of work. That's off the expressway. Let me end up by just talking about our cities and the real problems that beset us. When you look at our city, this happens to be a picture of Melbourne, but you can take a very comparable picture in Sydney. There's planless congestion. So it's all developing like a mushroom, a rudderless ship. There's a drawing by Niemeyer of some years ago encapsulating just what is wrong with a city that glues one building next to the other, no light, no air, congestion on the footpaths, impossible traffic, and this is the status quo that seems to have no end to it. You look at the physical end result, that's what we get. This is Milson's Point, brand new. This has come into existence in the last 15 years or so. It really is horrific. Gaps of 1.5 meters between buildings that have habitable rooms facing them onto such narrow gaps. You know, people talk about the slums of Naples, at least they're charming. Now, it is all also driven by this strange phenomenon, which is the obsession with so-called heritage. This building had to be kept. Or, when it wasn't kept, in fact, the bit that's kept is in the middle is an old building. The rest of it had to imitate something old. It's brand new, of course. Everything is driven by heritage, and you're supposed to say that with religious fervor in your voice. The truth, it is utter fakery. It is quite incredible because, anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute. But the other ills, of course, of this sort of congestion and the heritage that goes with it are these terrible buildings that you look at from the aeroplane in Sydney. Sorry, I think there's another, no. Yeah. Barrack-like buildings. You know, there's Western Sydney, so it's absolutely covered with these sort of substandard housing, 3-story blocks of flats. So no wonder that, sorry, I'm still looking for something else here. Something's gone wrong here. Anyway, because of this congestion and this lack of answer to housing in near suburbs, it's no wonder that somebody suggested, well, what about the tallest building in the world? Instead of having everything glued together, just leave space around one giant high building. Of course, it hasn't come about, it's not likely to either. Oh, here's a picture of that housing that I showed before. Something seems to be out of kilter here. There are the gaps between living rooms facing each other across this gap. And here's a house, and a house. You see, they do nothing to help along. They just say, yes, from now on you can pull down that house and you can build a block of flats. Well, this shows a desperate attempt in the city, at least to produce some open space, even if raised off the street, for a building that desperately looks for elbow room on both sides. But that again was one of those competitions that win some, lose some. This is another attempt at maximizing the limited opportunities that exist of putting the balconies at least on the edges of the building that will have views in particular directions. But you're fighting a constant battle against the lack of foresight planning. Sorry, this goes together. Now that is the monument to what I was talking about. If you can't keep the building, just keep the front. And this is the front. Now it would almost be understandable if it were a genuine old front. The fact is that there was a front like that here. It fell apart, and they made this, whoever built this building, replicate it. This is all made out of aluminium and concrete block, imitating what was once there. And the obsession with, you know, here's some old bit of facade, there's a brand new building glued up against the inside of it, because this is considered a national monument. There's no architectural, any kind of value in this, but it is the thing that just destroys the opportunities the city might give us. They love arches, you see. Here, at least, it does carry a bit of weight. But then this is the modern interpretation of history, holding up thin air. And you find that everywhere. You find the pediments, every building in the suburbs, put a pitched roof on it. If you haven't got a pitched roof, put a pitched roof front on it. And that. So it's a kitsch era, I'm afraid, that we live in, and I think I'm saying these provocative things only to needle the young and the recent graduates here to dedicate themselves to do something in the future that would go forward. And I show this picture is Gary's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, an incredible structure that really exploits the computer, that not only gives us drawings, but the computer attached to machines will make anything. All this repetition of identical components is no longer, or less and less, true anymore by what the computer can give us. And so there's a new whole world of opportunity to creative building emerging. But none of this is permitted when we are told, heritage, please. So I'll leave those sad thoughts and hopefully provocative ones with you. Thank you.
Professor Seidler has graciously offered to be happy to take questions and discussion. The floor is yours. If you wish to use the mic, you're welcome to. If you don't feel the need to, please ask or speak from wherever you are.
Sorry, what's that?
What's your response to Bob Carr's comments over the last month with it?
Yeah, well, he's totally misinformed, obviously, because he says what a terrible block of flats that is in his electorate, with these sort of pediment, the very thing I just showed you a minute ago. Terrible design that people produce. The fact is, the fault lies in his government and his instrumentalities that insist on that very piece of kitsch to be applied to an innocent building. So unless it's the local building inspector and so-called town planner who went to TAFE for 3 months, and he's the expert, he knows all about aesthetics and architecture, he tells you, now make it fit in, around here there's buildings with pitch roofs and you've got to put one of these on. A car goes along and says it's ugly. Well, it's his fault that it's ugly because he does nothing about it to stop that kind of anti-cultural nonsense. So there's a picture in the paper of the very thing that I showed you, the fake pediments on top of a building. It says it's ugly. So that's my response to him. If he really wanted to, he could stop this sort of nonsense overnight, It wouldn't be politically very astute. But I think everybody would clap him if he did. Because this has gone too far, in my 50 years experience, it's now become much worse. It's not only a matter of, I don't like the shape of your roof, or I don't like, whatever you're building there, I don't like it. That's a matter of opinion, and he's entitled to it. But now it is cloaked in this holy word, heritage. It isn't heritage, you see. So now they get away with it. Everybody seems to want to have heritage. I showed you what fakery it all amounts to. So if somebody really wanted to, you could stop the very thing that I think is against the United Nations Charter, which entitles creative people to have the right to what they produce. And here, all these young architects that I understand are here, you've got a big fight on your hands to design anything that you want and believe in, because you're going to be told by these sub-professionals you're not allowed to do that. That's a very sad state of affairs. The Act needs to be amended that gives aesthetic power to local councils. Yes?
I think we all agree with that most architecture in Sydney is information architecture, is quite appalling, about 80%. Why do you think it's the case? Why is it so bad?
Why is it so bad?
Yes.
Well, you see, the essence of it is that as a young architect who rang me up and he says, look, I designed the house and the clients like it, and I go to the council and they knock it back and they want me to put a picture. I got the money to go to pay $2,500 just to be heard in the Land Environment Court. My client just wants a house. He says, don't mess around, just build me a house. And the guy says, no, what am I going to do? I've got a wife and I've got a little kid and I've got to make a living. And that's why it gets worse by the day, because people get disenchanted and get demoralized about trying to do creative things. It's just against the law here, actually. It's as bad as that, and I believe it's now worse than it was 50 years ago, where you could be heard in an actual court of law, and if you won, the council had to pay your costs, and that's no longer so. I think it's an absolutely draconian situation. They are protected. Everybody blames the developers. That's not true. You have some effective town planners that show developers where they can build their buildings so that they all fit together and don't take each other's views away, and the traffic works and the public transport works, and they'll be much happier to do a decent thing. Whereas here, they stand over you and they have nothing to offer other than saying no. Restrictive rules, that runs the show. So that's why everything's so ugly. Yes?
Do you feel that anyone's classified,
Pardon?
has the authority to lodge plans to the council?
I'm sorry, what's that again?
Do you feel that anybody has the ability to lodge plans to council?
Yes.
Anybody can do that?
Anybody, yes. Free country, they say, but there's no, I mean, in other countries there is a limit. You know, you can do internal things or certain remodeling, but above a certain volume or area of work, it has to be done by an architect. And let me also say this, where we're comparing things to a European city, which is not unique, Austria, there's a Department of Architecture in Vienna. And when an architect designs a building and it is approved, and nobody argues aesthetics, that would be, they can't believe when I tell them, there are people here standing over me telling me how to design buildings. They said, you must be joking. They encourage progressive architecture. They want good architecture. In fact, when a client says, I want to leave something out, as happened in my case, where the private client said, I don't want this, and he says, I'm paying for it, leave that thing out. I went to the department, I said, you approve to these plans and they become law, what an architect draws. And they want to leave that out. So they sent their officials to the site and said, we understand you want to leave out this overhead light. Well, you can do that, but this building will never get a license to operate, and walked away. So that's the way architects and their work is protected in those cities. Not here. Yeah.
What do you think of the Frank Sartor competition rules in the city, or competitions for building?
Yeah. You know, he's trying to get away with, he's always blaming other people. Everything's ugly, and now from now on we're going to have competitions, everything will be beautiful. The fact is, he is the author, together with Mrs. Farrelly, who used to be a councillor there, the author or the approving authority of the East Circular Quay. They all hide behind, you know, they all run for cover when the chips are down. Sartor is the one that had made this rule about every building in Sydney being built to the edge of the footpath. That's his law. Now don't let him tell you that buildings aren't beautiful enough, because that is the most unintelligent piece of nonsense, a formula for intensive congestion and confusion in the city, and that's his law. So, but you voted for him, you know? You get what you vote for, so what can I do?
Harry, I'd like to hear your comments on what Councillor Sartor had to say about the circular quay the other day, when he stated that the reason that his council approved the toaster was that the land, had they not approved it, it would have gone to the Land Environment Court, and they would have lost in the Land Environment Court.
Nonsense.
You mentioned, of course, that Sydney City Council sold the road off to developers
right.
to make that possible.
Yeah, exactly. The court certainly wouldn't have insisted that public land be given away for next to nothing for some developer to make a fortune out of the thing, or trying to, except he advertises it every day. He can't even sell those ridiculous apartments there. It's unbelievable that the council would have sold public land for private profit for next to nothing. They paid $5 million for that whole stretch of road going to Opera House. And now, World Heritage submission of the Opera House is sort of stymied now because you can't even see the Opera House anymore. So our society is obviously not very concerned about it. We vote in the kind of people who will do this. So, Land Environment Courts, that's an absolute fact. It's untrue. He's the culprit because he sold public land quite unbelievably to private developers.
Harry, as a profession, we're pretty good at use the vernacular whinging.
Pardon?
As a profession, we're really good at, the point I'm trying to make is that the medical profession and the lawyers, as a group of people, are very strong, have a lot of strength within the profession. But as a profession, architects have forever been beaten around the head. How do we fix that? How do we make the young people here have some hope? Or how do we give them some hope within 5 or 10 years, things turning around? I mean, what would you do if you were given the opportunity to fix that?
I've attempted for months, if not years, to make the Institute make a strong attempt at changing the Act. And they've never come across, there's always, you might step on somebody's toes and, oh, look, don't rock the boat kind of thing, And they're weak. The Institute is extremely weak, I agree with you. So it needs a new generation to get a sledgehammer in their hand and fight for their rights. That's the only solution. And vote in people who just don't want to, make everything look so rosy, which it isn't.
Just on that point,
Yeah.
if you need medications prescribed, you get it from a doctor.
Sorry, what's that?
If you're a patient and you need medicines prescribed to yourself, you go to a doctor. If you have to submit counsel, you have to submit documents to council, why shouldn't it be the architect's role?
Why should it be the architect's role to do what?
To submit plans to council.
Well, that is a normal thing because, there is an authority to make sure that the fire stairs are the right width and the right material and there's enough ventilation in the building. That's not unreasonable to submit plans to make sure that they're healthy and safe. But when it comes to, we don't like the look of it, that's another matter. That's the big difference. I mean, what happens here, frankly, is comparable to a doctor, the hospital orderly telling the surgeon how to hold a knife. And don't argue, he's the boss, not the surgeon. That's what's going on architecturally here.
There's a question up on the left, Harry.
Everyone?
There's a question up on the left.
You
Yeah.
showed a slide of housing in Western Sydney, and I'm sort of wondering what your strategy would be in terms of public housing and rental accommodation, sort of changing the problems that you indicated there of housing by 3-story walk-ups achieved by Jowl. And I wonder if the Austrian, the Vienna example is appropriate here, maybe it may not be. So could you comment on that?
Well, I showed you the unbelievable conditions that brought this policy, which is a left-wing government of a city, into play ever since 80 years ago. We don't have that kind of pressure, it seems, here, because all we have is the unwillingness to take major steps without any spending of public money. The local council seems there's a pressure on for more people wanting to live here. So from now on, we're going to paint an area red. Here you can build flats, and up go those kind of barracks that I showed the pictures of. Now this is not planning. This is not intelligent and responsible foresight of the consequences. I can understand them saying from now on here you can build apartments, but this is how they should be planned. This shall be the place for the kindergarten. This shall be this and that, so that the total community can thrive and come into existence. Here they take a passive stance. They just have restrictive rules. Just stay back 5 feet here and 5 feet here, and go for your life, and you get these barracks. Because not a single cent of money is being spent on planning. Neither are there top professionals involved, nor are public funds brought into play. They just want people to pay for it themselves, and all they give them is the right to sell their house at a profit. That's all. Now, it's a very different world, you see, and as long as people accept what is happening like wildfire all over the expansion of Sydney into the west, that will continue going. We're just not mature enough to maybe use public funds, and politically that's untenable to make physical planning a reality, and it takes obviously seed money on the part of the community to bring this about. And our society just isn't used to that kind of proposition, it seems. Because they put up with the mess that I showed you. And if they do, there's no answer.
The question from a young woman in the middle left.
Yes.
The act is changed. The act for aesthetics is changed. And the public funds are given to Port Town planning. Do you see that would be enough of instigation or something to do enough to instigate better design?
Well, to remove the words design and approve the design and the neighborhood and so on, the environmental and design attributes of a building. That's one thing, and I think that's an anti-cultural thing, like I said, and it should be altered. It will not be an answer to suddenly, bring about a healthily planned community, such as we get in Scandinavian countries. They also have this kind of very strong social responsibility. They just refuse to live in slum-like conditions. But we seem to be putting up with it. I don't know the answer. But the good start would be to open the opportunities of these.
There was another one right in the middle of that section.
Yes.
You showed a lot of slides of artists whose work you found.
Sorry, I can't hear that.
You showed lots of slides of artworks, works that you found inspiring or relevant to your work. I just wanted to ask you if there was any contemporary artists that you found inspiration in.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that question.
What contemporary artists inspired you? What contemporary artists inspired you?
Oh, well, I showed you work that not only present day ones, people in the last few decades, but there are many others that one finds a sympathy with in what they are aiming to do visually. And I find that there's a certain correlation between what they do, what sculptors do, what architects do. You find parallels, not in all art, obviously, but in some.
Which practicing contemporary artists though? Today, artists today.
You mean you wanted me to name them? Well, it'd be a long list, and they live in all different parts of the world. I mean, there's, enormous numbers that do work that has direct relation to potential to spatial planning architecture. Yes.
Harry, what elements of architecture do you think should be regulated in local government? For example,
before the width of fire escape. Make sure that somebody has a 1 meter fire escape from hanger to hanger so that people can walk.
sorry, from an urban form point of view outside, exterior.
No, no control whatsoever.
No control on height.
Well, height is a planning matter. Show me the total physical plan and then I'll accept your height.
Don't you think an architect should have more of a role in planning, town planning?
Of course, ideally it should be the top professionals of the community that should do the physical plan, not this absurd, restricted, rule-type plan, which is a cop-out. You know, the people are incompetent, that's why they don't know what to do, so all they do is invent rules, stay back 5 feet here, 2 meters here, and go relax. And that is not planning.
So if an envelope is regulated, an architecture should have a free rein.
Show me a three-dimensional overall plan of the expansion area or the rebuilding area. Show me physically what should be. And then if somebody comes along and says, look, I don't want it just here, I want it this way, you can always argue about it as long as it doesn't create the overall physical reality of what is needed. I showed you the city of Canada. We changed that to the better. And they would listen. It is.
But aesthetics not to be regulated.
Certainly not. You want me to read you the wording that is so outrageous in our act? It's outrageous, the wording.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time for drinks.
Okay.
I've just got one question.
Can we have the questions held, please?
I think Harry is was going to read something from the act.
Harry, do you want to have a final word?
Sure. Yes, please. Yeah.
You want to have a final word? Or are we ready for
Not really. I think I've...
Can we thank Harry?